So once again, my name is James Lendemer, and I'm one of the research scientists at the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. And so, we've heard talks about nitrogen and its impacts on shellfish and fisheries, and we've heard talks about deer and deer browsing and the impacts that that has. And I think those are things that people in general are sort of familiar with as phenomena that we have to be aware of and think about. But today I'm going to talk about something that I think, most people know relatively little about, and that's lichens. So I hope that you view this talk sort of as a window onto a side of Long Island that most of you probably haven't seen before. So first off, everyone's general question is always, well, what is a lichen? And so I always start off my talk giving you a little bit of an explanation. What are lichens? Lichens are beautiful. Are they plants? Well, many people think that they're plants, and in fact, early botanists from the time of Linnaeus thought that was the case. You can imagine how, if you had no microscopes, as they didn't several hundred years ago, that you might think this leafy lichen here, this is Pseudocyphalaria from central Chile, was relatively similar to this trillium here. This has flowers, maybe these little fruiting bodies here, maybe people thought those were small flowers. Well, in fact, and they're both green, they're leafy, you could see how there's a few similarities. But in fact, lichens are not plants, and they are not closely related to them. Rather, lichens are fungi, so they are not plants. If we recognize that they're fungi, the question immediately arises, well, are all lichens closely related? Are all lichens related to each other? So if you looked at all the lichens that are out there in the world, and early botanists did this, and they thought, well, okay, they all look kind of similar. A lot of them are leafy, a lot of them are greenish, a lot of them look very different from most fungi. So they said, all right, well, these are all lichens. And then they looked at all of the fungi that were out there, and they said, well, those all look pretty similar. They don't look a lot like most lichens. So they thought that, in fact, lichens were one group, and fungi were another group unto themselves. Well, in fact, we've learned relatively recently, in the 1980s and 90s, that it's become clear that, in fact, lichens are fungi, just like fungi are fungi. They're, in fact, not all closely related to each other. And rather, what lichens are is a lifestyle that's been adopted by many different kinds of fungi. So what a lichen is a symbiosis, and the symbiosis that is formed by a fungus or a microbiont. So if you look at a section of a fruiting body of a lichen, you can see all of these clear areas here. Those are the fungal hyphae that are formed from the fungus, and then you'll see these clumps of green. Those are the algae. That's the photobiont. So it's a symbiosis formed by a fungus and an alga, and together they form these beautiful structures that look absolutely nothing like most fungi and most algae do in the wild. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that when we talk about lichens, we're talking about species of fungi, right? So lichens are classified based on the fungus. They're not classified based on the algae. Algae have their own names, they have their own systems of classification, and they're not related to the fungi that we're talking about today. They just form these relationships with them. It's also worth noting that all lichens, for the most part, are native. So we don't have the problems with invasive species that we have with a lot of other species. So when we're talking about lichens, we're talking about numbers of species of lichens, amounts of biodiversity. We're actually talking about native species. Again, just to reiterate that lichens really are a lifestyle that's been adopted by many different fungi, you can look at a section of the fungal tree of life. We have one here. And all of the different groups of fungi in this area of the tree of the fungal tree of life are coded by their lifestyle. Green are lichens, and you can see that the species, the groups that have this lichen-forming lifestyle that associate with an alga are intermixed among groups that have other lifestyles. So blue, I believe, is hemiparasites or symbionts, and then red, I think, is pathogens. You don't really have to be paying any close attention to this. Just see the fact that these colors are intermixed. So you have lichens occurring in the same groups of fungi as non-lichens and even pathogens. So if there's one thing that you probably learned in basic biology about lichens from your biology textbook, it's that they come mainly in three different forms. So your first form is the Fruticose lichens. Those are the three-dimensional ones that are bushy or shrubby. Think of things like old man's beard, like Usnea cornuta, or British soldiers, like your Cladonias here. Then there's the Foliose lichens. Those are the lichens that are leafy. So they have an upper surface and they have a lower surface, just like a leaf. Those are things like Xantho mendoza, these lovely yellow lichens, or Physia, these lovely gray lichens. Again, don't pay attention to the Latin names. Really just look at the fact that there's a tremendous diversity of colors, shapes, forms, and sizes here. Then if you have learned in basic biology there were those two kinds, then you've also probably heard that there's a third kind, the crustose lichens. Crustose lichens are not bushy, and they're not leafy. Instead, they're just like a crust that someone painted on the surface that they're growing on, be it a rock, be it soil, be it bark. These are the most diverse group of lichens. They're also the most highly understudied, and they're the groups that I tend to specialize in with my work at the Botanical Garden. Apparently, I also have a bit of a dry mouth right now. Lichens are also tremendously diverse. There's well over 25,000 species that have been described, and there's estimates of being well over 100,000 species in nature. And so I think that that's something that a lot of people don't realize. When you walk into the forest, most people think, oh yeah, well there's 3 or 4 kinds. There's the bluish-gray kind that's on the trees, there's the greenish kind that's on the trees, maybe there's rock tripes on grow on the rock, there's old man's beard. But in reality, there's often at a single site, even on a single rock, like this one in Pennsylvania, that rock is about the size of me. There is a little picture of a hammer right there. Even on that one rock, there's dozens and dozens of species that grow. And in fact, you can even get 3 species or multiple species that are closely related. So an example of that is in the dust lichens, which is the group that I worked on for my PhD dissertation. You know, they might not be the most attractive things. It's a face only a mother could love. But even on this single rock outcrop, there's 3 species that grow in completely different microhabitats depending on how much light and how much humidity there is. So that just gives you, I think, a sense of how even at small scales, there's a tremendous diversity of lichens in natural habitats, or at least there should be. And so those reasons, this tremendous diversity, are sort of why lichens are abundant and diverse everywhere, or at least they should be. So they're common and abundant in coastal forests in California, like this one on Montaña d'Oro. You can see all the lichens here hanging from the trees. They're common and abundant in rainforests, like these in central Chile. They're also abundant in extreme habitats, like in the driest interior deserts of western North America, Nevada, and Oregon and Idaho, and above tree line in places like above in the glaciers in Chile and South America, and really throughout the world. So if I've convinced you that lichens are diverse and abundant, at least they should be everywhere, then it probably is a logical extension of that lichens are also very important. So they're important in a number of different ways, and I'd just like to kind of touch on some of the examples of why that is, or how they are important. So the first is that they are really pivotal ecosystem pioneers. So they're important in the breakdown of rocks and the formation of soil. So here you have a pavement barren in Moosic Mountain in Pennsylvania, and there's lichens all over on the rocks. That's what the gray and the black dots are. They're breaking apart the rocks, which then form soil. And you can see these are all little patches of lichens that are forming patches of soil. It's only with the formation of soil and the cover of lichens that you're actually able to have mosses come in and then eventually vascular plants as well. They're also very fundamental for nutrient cycling in pretty much every terrestrial ecosystem around, especially in forests and humid forests. So the primary thing that's responsible for that are lichens that associate with cyanobacteria, and those are really pivotal for nitrogen fixation in some forests. They're also implicated in a number of other nutrient cycling phenomena, including phosphorus. So something else that I think a lot of people probably don't think about or aren't very aware of, and we certainly weren't as scientists until relatively recently, is the fact that lichens are very important for environmental regulation and buffering from extreme events. So lichens are highly absorbent, and so they can suck in water from the air very, very, very rapidly and swell up, and then they release it slowly back into the environment. And so when you look at a forest that's natural and has a large cover and abundance and diversity of lichens, you can imagine on a huge scale what those lichens are doing. So they're basically preventing these forests from getting too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. They're keeping them within a narrow range of temperatures and humidities, and that's very important for microorganisms and for small vertebrates and invertebrates as well that can only live within a certain narrow ecological range like that. Now, of course, they're also important food and shelter for many different large animals, the most famous example being reindeer or caribou. So you can see all over here in the tundra, or in the boreal forest in the Yukon, the lichens are all over here on the ground, and then they're also all over here on the rocks in the Gaspé Peninsula above tree line. Now you can imagine I don't walk around taking pictures of reindeer. They tend to shy away from my crack hammer and my chisel as I'm collecting lichens, so we'll just Photoshop in some right there. But the point is that lichens provide the major food source for these animals and for many others during the winter and other hard times. They're used by hummingbirds for building nests. They're used by flying squirrels for the same thing. They're very important for large animals. They're also very important for small animals. So there's a whole diversity of small invertebrates that are very important to ecosystems that rely directly upon lichens. And for me, my favorite example of that, again, coming back to the less than widely loved dust lichens, involves lacewings. So if any of you have ever seen a lacewing larva, you know that they cover themselves in this little ball of fuzz. So that's a lacewing larva that's covered itself in lichens. All lacewings preferentially use one kind of lichen for this, the dust lichens, or the genus Lepraria. So what that cover is doing is it's obviously providing them as camouflage so that they're not eaten or they're more difficult to find them. But it's also helping regulate their humidity. And how wet they are. So they stay moist. If you've ever looked at a lacewing larva, they're not exactly covered in a hard exoskeleton to prevent them from drying out. So the lichen stays sort of moist and keeps them from getting too wet or too cold. And then when they go to transform into an adult, they actually form their little capsule out of the dust lichen, and eventually the mature adult pops out. So that's just one example of a whole group of invertebrates that rely entirely upon one kind of lichen. There's a lot of invertebrates out there in the world, and you can probably imagine that there's a similar number of relationships between them and very specific and probably diverse groups of lichens as well. Finally, we move to the smallest scale, and that's within the lichen itself, there is a hidden universe. Lichens themselves function as a microcosm. So within a lichen, within this thallus, the body of the lichen that has the fungus and the algae that are forming their symbiosis, there's a whole host of other fungi, other algae, invertebrates like tardigrades, other bacteria, all of these things that actually occur nowhere else in nature and often are highly, highly specific to the species of lichens that they're growing in. A great example of this, you're probably wondering why there's a yin and yang symbol up here. In reality, this is the fruiting body of the Crustose lichen Lecanora rupicola. This is its fruiting body. And this black area here is a species of fungus, Arthonia varians, that only occurs on the fruiting bodies of this one species of fungus. One very close-knit relationship, one example of something that abounds in nature. So I hope that within this first 5 to 10 minutes of talking to you, I've convinced you all that lichens are absolutely amazing, important, and beautiful, and that rather than thousands of people going to Yellowstone to take pictures of Old Faithful, they should be turning around and taking pictures of the lichens that are on the rocks and trees there instead. Maybe one day. So if lichens are this diverse, and they're this important, and we should all be taking pictures of them, it probably is not an illogical extension to convince you that they're also producing tremendous services, and that when they're not present, ecosystems are compromised. So this is what a healthy lichen cover on a tree normally would look like in an undisturbed forest. So this is a old growth forest in the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. You can see there's these polypodium ferns here, there's some mosses here. More importantly, for my purposes and for everyone else's here, I hope, is that there's also this tremendous growth of lichens. You can see there's Foliose lichens, there's these Fruticose lichens here, hanging off the trees, and there's a tremendous diversity of Crustose lichens that you just can't see in a picture like this. But then let's go a little closer to home in the Palisades and really anywhere else around New York City and in most other metropolitan areas, urban or suburban or even rural areas too. Where are the lichens? There are none. You might find a skink, you might find some poison ivy, but the contrast here is quite significant. So as I go through the rest of my talk today, I'd like you to think about just how compromised and how different this forest must be compared to this one. And it's worth saying, I just drove here from New York City. This is what I saw. I didn't see anything that looked like this. So Long Island, it's a very long island, and the commute can be longer depending on traffic. So we actually have a pretty good idea of what lichens should be here compared to many other areas and of North America and abroad. And the reason for that is that unlike many areas, we have a really strong historical baseline of what lichens were growing here prior to basically the 1930s and into the 1800s and before. And so we have a really strong historical baseline of what species were there. Botanists, natural historians of the time went around and collected lichens. They did it a lot. And in fact, there was a checklist of the lichens of New York City and the vicinity published in the early 1800s. And that listed hundreds and hundreds of species. And then in the 1960s, Ernie Brodo, who is a lichenologist that was born in the Bronx, moved to Flushing, Queens, and then eventually to Canada, to the Canadian Museum of Nature, he wrote his PhD dissertation on the lichens of Long Island. And so he collected and studied Long Island extensively in a period when it underwent rapid change in terms of residential development and loss and degradation of natural habitats. So what we know from this data, from all of the extensive historical data that we have, is that of course there's these common and widespread species. Those were around. Things like Parmelia squarosa, that's this dust lichen, Lepraria finckii, those were really common and often quite abundant. There were also mature forest indicator species, so these Fruticose lichens like Old Man's Beard, Usnea pennsylvanica. You've noticed that it's named Pennsylvanica. Well, the reason it's named that is that it was first collected by Henry Muhlenberg, one of the sort of fathers of American botany, near his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It has never been, in the early 1800s, it's never been collected in Pennsylvania after 1900. Same thing on Long Island. Things like Heterodermia squamulosa. These are mature forest indicators. You go into an old growth forest, this is what you see. We also know that there was a tremendous diversity and abundance of sensitive cyanolichens. So those are the lichens that are particularly important for nitrogen fixation. So things like Sticta, things like this beautiful Pseudocyphalaria. We know those were common and abundant. And we also know that there was just a tremendous high diversity of crustose lichens, those groups that are relatively understudied that I work on a lot. We know that there were genera that had 12, 13, 14, several dozen even species, and they were relatively common. And we know that Long Island was the core range of some endemic species from the mid-Atlantic. So things like Cladonia atlantica, that pretty much occurs from North Carolina up to Massachusetts. Many of the populations are all on Long Island. Cladonia submitis, that's another reindeer lichen or another fruticose lichen. This has a much narrower distribution. And again, the majority of the populations are in southern New Jersey and Long Island. And interestingly, we also know that Long Island is the northern distributional limit of many southern species. So you have things like Parmotrema submarginale, that's this Foliose lichen here. It's a weed in the southeastern United States. And then it becomes less and less common as you go northwards. There's a handful of collections on Long Island, and the last one is up there on Nantucket. I think that's Nantucket. And then finally, we know that Long Island is the meeting place of the northern and southern biotas. And a great example of that is with these Parmotremas, these Foliose lichens. So there's two species that are very similar in appearance and differ in chemistry. The yellow dots here are one of those, and the red dots are another. And so the red dots are a northern species, northern Appalachian species. The yellow dots are southeastern coastal plain species, and they meet here in the mid-Atlantic. And mainly on Long Island is the last place where they co-occur together. Meeting place of north and south. So that's what should be here. There should be a lot of diversity. But we also know, if there's one thing we know about Long Island, and I think that that's really been brought home today from the two talks that we've already heard, is that there's an extensive and long-term history of sort of human change to the landscape. And that's something that's really intensified greatly in recent decades. And we know that the lichens have been greatly impacted. As I said, I drove here from New York City, and this is what I see every day in my home in Manhattan, and this is what I saw on my drive here. What you do not see is this. And I think that it's worth it now to point out there were all of these great photographs of forests in the last talk, of forests in many areas of the Northeast, and especially in the Massachusetts and Connecticut, Rhode Island, Long Island, adjacent areas in lower downstate New York. This is not what you see. All of those pictures had trees in them. They might not have had very many herbaceous plants because of the deer, but they had trees, relatively large trees. How many of them had lichens on them? Almost none. So you don't see things like this. This branch, from the Great Smoky Mountains, there's 6 species of macrolichen that occur just on this branch. Picked it up out of, I didn't select this, it was just the one I happened to pick up. Everything looks like that. That's not what you see here. So what we know we've lost are these mature forest indicators, Fruticose macrolichens, things like this old man's beard, things like Ramalina americana. These sensitive cyanolichens that are so important for nitrogen fixation, things like lungwort, that was certainly known historically. I think it was even known into the 1960s. It hasn't been found since. Nephroma helveticum, that's another one. And we've lost many of these crustose lichens that there's a tremendous diversity of. So we know that there's about 300 species that have been found on Long Island at some point in time, and all of them are presumed to be native. So again, we don't have invasive species with lichens, thankfully. So they're all presumed to be native. But we know that already over a fifth of them are presumed to be extirpated or lost. And about a fourth to a third of the remainder are presumed to be rare. In other words, threatened or endangered, at least at a local, regional level. And so what this really means is that right now, when we're out in the forest and we're looking at plants, we're looking at animals, we're looking at lichens, we're looking at everything, we're living and thinking in a landscape that is already characterized by a tremendous loss of biodiversity, as is quite evident from the lichens. It's the most visible indicator of that, I think. And so we're all accustomed to this. And that's our baseline now, and that's not what the baseline was historically. And I think the logical question is, why should we care about any of this? We're pouring money into, or some money, others might disagree about the quantity, but we're certainly funding study of things like nitrogen and the impacts of deer browsing, but that's not the case for lichens. We know virtually nothing about lichens, how they function, and what the losses to the ecosystems really are in a quantitative way. And I'm a lichenologist. There's fewer than 12 of us in the country that are studying this. That should be, why should we care? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but the real primary one for me is that it's obvious from the work that I do throughout the United States and the world that we are having fundamental impacts to ecosystems. You could put a picture of New York City here, but I prefer to put a giant city like Santiago, Chile, because it's really easy to imagine the impacts that a huge city like this, with its haze of pollution here, are having on surrounding ecosystems. It's worth also pointing out, the reason I like putting this picture into talks is that this is Parque Santa Lucia, which is a small mountain in the center of Santiago. It's where Darwin stood on his voyage for the Beagle and looked out on what was then the city of Santiago in the mid-1800s, right? So imagine how much that has changed since Darwin's time. We're having tremendous ecosystem impacts, and our impacts are directly impacting biodiversity directly as well. And biodiversity is not just deer, it's not just herbaceous plants, it's not just wildflowers, it's this millions and millions of species on Earth, and that includes the hundreds of thousands of species of fungi, millions of species of fungi, really, the dozens of species of land snails, all of the tremendous, algal diversity, everything. It's everything. It's not just us. It's not just the things that we see very readily. It's everything that supports them. And the loss of lichens in areas like Long Island that have been observed is a very visible way to understand and communicate the loss of biodiversity that is occurring worldwide. It also happens to be a national tragedy that is unfolding before our eyes and no one is doing anything about effectively and is relatively understudied. And it's not just a tragedy that's confined to lichens and confined maybe to Long Island or other highly urbanized areas along the East Coast and throughout the United States. If you think of a lichen as being at the center of the ecosystem, as I think we all should, the lichen is at the center. It functions as a hub of trophic interactions. everything in an ecosystem in some way probably involves a lichen. And so it has this supporting role for all these other organisms. And so suddenly, when you remove that lichen, it has the strong potential to have cascading and largely unforeseen impacts on all of the species that are in some way involved with it. When you remove the hub, it's a problem. Now, as I said, on Long Island, a fourth or a third of the species are presumed to be threatened or endangered. Probably about a fifth of them are already gone. And that's not just something, again, that's confined to this relatively small area. It's a phenomenon that we see everywhere. So this is a small selection of species that are critically endangered just in the eastern United States, or United States. I guess there's some western ones there. So this is just a small selection. There are many, many species that are critically imperiled and in danger of extinction in the United States and all over the world. How many species of lichens do you think, how many species of these important ecosystem service providing organisms are protected by the Endangered Species Act? Wow, 2. There's more than 5,500 species known, and we find new ones at a rapid pace, many of which are also rare and endangered. There's 2 listed on the Endangered Species Act. There's 2 listed on the IUCN Red List internationally. That does not reflect reality. And so if there's one thing I'd sort of like to conclude with, I don't like to get up and present lots of graphs and things like that, because I think that it's better to try and take home just the broader message with this. And that's that we should, first of all, be very concerned with what has happened and what is happening around us, and not be sort of lulled into complacency with accepting this lower level of biodiversity that we see around us now. We need to remember that this is what is natural. But in fact, we also have to have a lot of recognition and a lot of action to move forward with caring for what we have left. And so with that, I think I'd like to just take some questions.
We have plenty of time for questions.
My name is Daniel Karp, and I live in Lloyd Harbor, New York. I've lived there 60 years. When I was a child, we never saw lichens on the trees at all. Around 1970, I saw a paper in the New York State Conservationist about the distribution of lichens in the New York metropolitan area. And basically, there were very few in New York City, and less on Long Island, at least the middle of Long Island. If you wanted to see them, you had to go out to the East End. Mm-hmm. But in the last 20 years, due to the success of the National Clean Air Act, I've seen more lichens on my trees and on dead wood on my property than I never saw before. And I want to also tell you something else interesting, is that New York City has now banned the burning of number 6 fuel oil as of July of this year. So one should, I think, see a resurgence in the species diversity of lichens in New York City parks, and I think that that would be a great study to start doing work on right now.
So what you've observed is exactly what other people have observed, and we've looked at, for instance, in Central Park, we know that in the 1980s there was basically nothing growing there in terms of lichens. But there was a bioblitz there, I think 2 years ago now. My graduate student and I went and inventoried the lichens, and then she led the group of participants that went out and looked for all the lichens during the bioblitz. We found 20-some species. I mean, I run in Central Park every day, and there are lichens this big growing on rocks and growing on trees. Now, that being said, and the same thing is true in the Bronx and the botanical gardens, we've seen lichens return. And that's true. So that's a success story. And that's certainly a note of positivity that I have to convey. But the reality is that what has come back is a relatively small number of species, most of which are disturbance tolerant and pollution tolerant. And so it's a success story in terms of, yes, we have cleaned up the air and the environment to such an extent that things are returning. But we have degraded the habitats and caused so much fragmentation and loss of many of the species from large areas from which they used to occur that it will probably be decades or hundreds of years before we start to see the types of the numbers of species, especially old growth, indicators and things that are very sensitive to air pollution that we would have seen historically, if that ever happened.
Well, I know because I've hiked in the mountains of western North Carolina. I know how diverse and how, especially when you get up to the upper elevations above 4,000 or 5,000 feet into your yellow birch, beech, sugar maple forest, the lichen diversity becomes enormous, and also the humidity there is much greater than it is in the lowlands at 2,000 feet because of the impact of the clouds hitting the mountains at those elevations. You get incredible rainfall in western North Carolina in some places, 80 to 100 inches a year in the Great Smoky Mountains and possibly in the Asheville watershed area.
But lest you think that that is why there is a tremendous diversity of lichens there would have been the same amount, though, well, in the southern Appalachians at low and middle to elevations, there's actually a similar number of species. There might not be necessarily as conspicuously abundantly dripping from the trees as they do at the high elevations, but the diversity is even, and in fact even greater at middle to low elevations, which are not nearly as humid. Again, it's the impacts that we've had are lesser there. And so what you see there is what would have characterized all of eastern North America and the world in reality. So my colleagues and I just finished a large study in the mid-Atlantic coast from southern New Jersey to northern Florida, and we've found one region which is a previously overlooked biodiversity hotspot in coastal North Carolina in the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And so basically there were double, triple the number of species there that were found anywhere else. Many of them are species that now occur nowhere else, and some of them were in fact new to science and very rare. Why were those there? It's because it's the largest contiguous protected area left in the entire mid-Atlantic, and it's the only place that has intact old-growth forests.
There are some old-growth forests on Long Island. I've discovered black tupelo trees, 700 years old in Blandenberg County Park, and that might be a place you want to go to.
Oh, for sure. There's some spots like that in southern New Jersey, like Bear Swamp, that are absolutely spectacular.
I've been to Bear Swamp with Bruce Kirshner. We had an expedition there about 10 years ago. Unfortunately, Bruce is deceased in 2007.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a great opportunity for more work.
Other question?
Yes, I have another question. You might be happy to know that if there are only 12 lichenologists in the country, I'm working with 4 high school research students who want to do some DNA sequencing of lichens. So I was wondering if you had any information to help us in that process.
Just send me an email, and I'd be happy to give you some details on that. We routinely work with high school students, college students, really anyone that's interested, and I work with school teachers and stuff like that, for sure. Yeah, there's certainly things that can be done, yeah.
You're at the Botanical Gardens?
Mm-hmm.
All right, wonderful, thank you.
If you Google James and lichens, I think I'm the only one that comes up. So
I'll shout since I'm in the middle, but James, you ended with a slide saying we need to care for what we have left.
Yep.
How do we do that?
How do we do that? Number one, be aware ourselves. And number two, raise awareness amongst others. I mean, there's a lot that can be done in terms of raising awareness and educating others about the visible impacts of biodiversity loss. I mean, what we see with lichens is this is just a visible symptom of a much larger problem. And it's a very complex problem and difficult problem to solve. But many of the solutions that are out there or many of the things that are being talked about to solve the other problems that we have that are related to that would fix the problem for lichens as well. Stop logging our forests, number one. Protect more areas, clean air, things like that, clean water. There's a lot of things that go hand in hand with everything else that we talk about at a natural history symposium, just bringing lichens into the mix and really using that as a tool to educate people that are not necessarily so interested about biodiversity or species or conservation. I think that when you talk to people, legislators, the lay public, about the loss of native species, for instance, when you talk about vascular plants, wildflowers, something like that, when you start trying to convey, well, there's this many species in this area, and then this many species in this area, often there's so many invasive species that come in that the number of species in a disturbed, lot in an inner city could be very high. And it might even be on par with the number of species you might see in an old-growth forest. Now, that's probably not exactly true, but the point is you have to start conveying nuance. And by the time you've done that, most people's eyes have glazed over and they've stopped paying attention. But when you have lichens, there are no invasive species. Having nothing on a tree and something on a tree is something that is readily obvious and visible to anyone. It doesn't require conveying the nuance that you have to convey about invasive species and things like that.
Okay, thank you.